In a previous video, we spent some time mapping out this stick figure girl, figuring out what all the coordinates were for the various pieces of the stick figure girl. For the head, we had to figure out the center position for the ellipse and the width and the height of the ellipse. For the dress, we had to figure out the XY positions for each of the vertices. For the legs, we had to figure out the 2 points for each of the legs. And for the feet, we had to figure out the center position for each of the ellipses to make up the feet and the width and the height of the feet. So we spent some time figuring out these calculations, and most of our calculations came from the position of the head. So almost everything was relative to the positioning of the head. So we wrote that out in code. We coded it up and we did ellipses, triangles, lines, etc. In the end, I talked about putting some comments in so that we would actually be able to figure out what we were trying to draw. So my comments say, okay, we draw the head, draw the dress, etc. And we came up with the code that drew the stick girl. Now the stick girl that's drawn by this particular piece of code is positioned in one particular place. So we did all of our calculations relative to the head. What if I now wanted to put my stick girl up here? What would we need to do? Well, in order to do that, we'd need to go back and recalculate all of the different vertices and points and everything for each of our pieces of the stick girl. Okay, in order to move this girl, we'd have to recalculate everything. Also, if I wanted to draw multiple stick girls on my sketch, what would I need to do? Well, I'd need to replicate this code and redo the calculations for each of the different instances of the girl that I want to put on the screen. This is where functions come in handy. So I'm going to show you how we can create a stick girl function, which we can call over and over again to make multiple stick girls on our screen. So in order to turn this into a function, I'm going to define my function. So I'm going to use the def keyword, DEF, for define. I'm going to call this stick girl, put empty parentheses there for now, saying that I don't have any parameters to pass into this function, and I put a colon at the end of the function. So I'm making what I called in previous videos a user-defined function. This is me being the user, and I'm defining the function. Okay, so everything that goes into my function, all of the lines of code in my function, need to be indented to say all of these lines of code are part of my function. So I'm going to use the edit and increase indent to indent all of these lines. So now I'm going to call this, everything that I just indented, I'm going to call a block. So everything that is indented underneath this def keyword is a block of code. And it's all associated with this function that I defined here called stick girl. Okay? If I were to run this right now, this piece of code, I'd pop up my sketch window with nothing in it. So there's nothing drawn in this. Why not? Because I haven't called this function. I need to call the function in order for it to work. So I'm going to call stick girl here. We must spell the function exactly the same way as it is when it's defined. So down here when I call it, if I try calling stick girl with a small g, this isn't going to work because there's no function defined that is of that name. Okay, so I'm going to call stick girl, and when I run this, stick girl appears just as it did before, but now I'm calling it in a function. Now I could call stick girl again, because functions are great for things that we want to repeat over and over again. And when I run this, well, I only see one stick girl. Why is that? Because the function is drawing that stick girl in the same position. So in fact, I've drawn the circle twice, I've drawn the triangle twice, etc. So there are two stick girls here, but they're drawn in the same position, so I don't see the two stick girls. Okay, so what I might like to do is I might like to add some parameters to this stick girl function, which will allow me to move this stick girl around the screen. So I might like to put a stick girl here where I see it specified already. I might like to put another one up here, and I might like to put another one over here. So I'd like to repeat this stick girl calling the same function. How could I do that? Well, my stick girl if I remember back over here, if I remember how I came up with the stick girl, all of my calculations were done relative to this center point of the head. If I modify this function to pass in as a parameter the center of the head, then I can do all these calculations within my function, because computers are very good at doing calculations. And if I do all my calculations relative to the position of the head, then I can draw different stick figures in different places on my screen. So let's see what that would look like. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify my function so that I pass in my head X position and my head Y position. So I'm going to give my function this position right here, this 250 by 250, but I can specify whatever position I want for the head. If I want the center of the head to be up here, then I'll pass it, say 30, 50. And the function will draw a stick figure with the head starting here, and the rest of this body and legs will be positioned according to the center of the head. So just specifying the center of the head is not enough. I have to modify my function so that these calculations take into account these values that are going to be passed in. So I'm going to pass it in the head X and the head Y, and my calculations down here need to be done relative to the head position. Okay, so my ellipse, I'm going to draw at head X and head Y. Okay, this doesn't intuitively make a lot of sense. You need to think about this head X and head Y as being values that will be given when the function is run. So when I write the function, I'm writing it in a general format. When I'm running the function, these variables head X and head Y will have values. So when I run the function, head X is going to be a value. Maybe it's 255, maybe it's 10. And head Y is going to be a value. Okay, for the dress, my top vertex, how did I calculate the point there? Well, my X value is just simply head X, it's 250. My Y value, I got from the Y value from the center of the head, and I added 30, the radius of the head. So it was head Y plus 30. Oops, plus 30. For my next position, I have 190 for the X position. So how did I get that? I have head X minus 30, the radius of the head, minus another 30. So I had head X minus 30, or minus 60, sorry. For the Y position of this vertex, how did I figure that out? I went from the Y position of the head, so I had head Y, and I added 30, and then I added another 100 to end up with 380. So I added 130. For the final vertex of the dress, my X position, I went from the center of the head, so head X, and I added 30, and I added 30. So I added another 60 onto that to get to 310. And for the final Y position, for the Y position of this vertex, how did I get that? Well, it was actually, it would be actually the same as this Y position. So head Y plus 130. Okay, so that's the dress. Okay, so I think that you get the idea. I'm not going to walk through every single one of these calculations. I'll leave that as an exercise for you. Now I have all of the code written with the calculations relative to this head X and head Y that I pass into this function. Okay, so let's try running it. Okay, I've got my call to stick girl down here. I need to modify one more thing. I need to pass in some parameters into the stick girl function now because this function is expecting 2 parameters. What are these parameters doing? It's telling me what is the position of the head that I want this entire figure to be based on. The calculations need to be based on something. I need to pass it that information in order for this function to be able to do its job. Okay, so I need to put something in here. So I'll just use 250, 250 to start with to make sure that my picture looks similar to the one that I had before. And when I run this, I see that my stick girl does indeed look very similar to the one that I had before. So it's doing these calculations. I presume it's doing the calculations correctly. Let's try putting a stick girl somewhere else. So let's move stick girl up here. So now I'm going to specify for my head maybe 100 by 100, let's say. So I'm going to change 250, 250 to 100, 100. And my stick girl should now appear up in a different part of my sketch. Now that I have a function that I can use over and over again, I can use it for multiple purposes. So I can move the stick girl to a different part of the screen, and all of the calculations associated with this stick girl are done within this function based on these parameters that I pass into the function. Think about it. This is exactly the same as what we're doing with, say, an ellipse function, right? I give it a different set of parameters and it customizes that ellipse based on the parameters that I gave it. I'm doing exactly the same with the parameters that I pass into my stick girl function. I'm telling it what's the starting position of my head, and my function is doing the calculations based on that. Another thing that I can do now that I have a function is I can call it over and over and over again to draw multiple stick girls on the screen. So let me put back the one at 250, 250, and also have the one at 100, 100. And I get two stick girls on the screen. I could put another one up here as well. So I could call stick girl again. So I can call this function over and over and over again. So I'll put it at 350, 100. I'll put another one up here. So this is the main reason that we have functions. One, it groups a set of statements together that has a particular functionality, hence the name function. Okay, and it also allows us to reuse that function with some kind of customization. So I call the function with different parameters, and the function uses that information that I gave it to do something similar but different. Okay, I have a challenge for you. So now that you understand what I'm doing with these parameters, I'd like you to modify this code to take one more parameter. So it's going to take a head X, a head Y, and it's also going to take the size of the head. So the head is always going to be a circle, so my height and my width of the ellipse is always going to be the same number. So I want you to add one more parameter here to take in the size of the head and modify this function so that it uses the head size to do the calculations for you. So stop the video, try that out, see if you can make that work, and then come back and I'll walk through it with you. Okay, so we want to add one more parameter. So I'm just going to call it H size, the head size. Okay, so that's going to be some number that comes in here. So I'm going to change first my ellipse to take H size, so it's going to make the head using all the parameters that I've passed in, the head X and the head Y and the H size for the head size. Something else that I'm going to do is I'm going to add another variable called H radius, which is going to be H size divide by 2. Whoops, divide by 2, not 3. Okay, why am I going to add this variable? Well, many of my calculations actually depend on using the radius as opposed to the diameter for the head size. So I'm going to make another variable called H radius, which can be used in my calculations without having to keep dividing this H size by 2. Okay, so what do I need to change here? So my triangle, this vertex, I'm going to add 30. So I've hard-coded in my last version of this code, I hard-coded this head radius. Okay, so I'm going to then use the variable instead of just putting the 30 in there. I'm going to calculate this y value here by taking the y value for the head, the center of the head, and adding the head radius. Same with this next vertex here. What I was doing was I was calculating this vertex based on the center of the head, subtracting the head radius, and then subtracting another 30. Okay, so I had an offset from the head to the skirt. So what I'm going to do is actually, just to make my code a little bit more easy to read, instead of just putting a 30 in here for the head or for the dress offset, I'm going to make another variable called dress offset, set it to 30, which indicates the difference between the side of the head and the dress. Okay, so this is going to be called, this little 30 that I have in here is going to represent the dress offset. So that's going to be a variable as well. So this point here would be at head x minus head radius minus the dress offset. Now you'll see that this is getting a little bit longer. Okay, so it's making my code a little bit longer, but the variables are allowing me to understand how I'm doing this calculation. So there aren't just these random numbers there. There's words that say what I'm doing. So I'm taking the head x value minus the radius minus the dress offset, which will give me this point here. Okay, so although it's adding some bulk to my code, using the variables is adding readability to my code. Okay, so how did I get this y value? Well, I started with the head y. I added 30, so I added the head radius, and then I added another 100 for the dress length. So let's make that also another variable. So I'm going to make dress length, that was 100. Okay, so I decided that this would be 100 pixels down here. So I'm going to add the dress length to this as well. Okay, so this makes it fairly clear how I'm calculating that particular vertex. The last vertex, I had head x plus the head radius plus the dress offset. For the y value here, I had head y, plus I have the head radius, plus I have the dress length. Okay, so I think you get the picture. I'm not going to spend the whole video going through all these calculations. But here's the final code. I've added a few extra variables just to make things read a little bit better. I've added a leg length, the dress length, and I added a couple of variables down here when I was doing the legs to have so that I would know the top of the leg and the bottom of the leg. These are Y positions, and I use these variables for the feet as well. Okay, so let's try running this. So I've got my stick girl at 250, 250. I need to add another parameter here, which is the size of the head. So I'm going to add the 60, which is what we were using before, just to make sure that my stick girl is working the way I expect it to. So everything looks the same. Now I'm going to do some customization. Okay, so let's try changing the size of my head to be 100, and what happens to my stick girl? Okay, everything gets a little bit wider. Why? Because I've changed the size of my head, so all these calculations are based on the center position of this head and the width of the head. So everything adjusts according to the size of the head. So I change my head and I'll make 25 here. So the size of the stick girl changes relatively. Now the size of the dress, the length of the dress, the length of the legs, etc., those weren't dependent upon the head size. So the height of the figure stays the same. Okay, I can still move the stick girl around. So I'll move her up to 125, 150, and keep the small head. Okay, and I can make a number of these girls. all over my screen with different size heads and different positions. So I can customize the girls based on the parameters that I'm taking into my function. Okay, so the takeaways from this video are: 1, how to define a function. So we've defined a function that looks like this, and we've talked about the idea of using parameters to customize our function and for the purpose of reuse.